Welcome to day 2 of the virtual workshop series on Alt-AC in Comm, exploring career options beyond the academy for communication PhDs. Today's workshop focuses on the theme on being a professional researcher. This virtual workshop series is being broadcast from Tohono O'odham, Akimel Utam, and Posh lands in Arizona. My name is Dr. Sarah J. Tracy. I am a professor at Arizona State University, and I thank the National Communication Association Advancing the Discipline Grant, the Transformation Project, and the Hugh Downs School of Human Communication for generously funding this workshop series. So why this series? Why now? Why are we doing this? So for a long time, I have been interested in cultivating opportunities for doctoral students, not only inside the academy, but outside as well. And what we have found in the communication discipline and in a lot of social science and humanities disciplines is that we are pretty good at helping our doctoral students with professional development within the academy. But an ongoing issue, that was the case when I was going to graduate school years ago, is this sort of lack of understanding or mentoring in terms of alternative academic jobs. And this has become an increased problem with the tenure track jobs continue to shrink. This is true especially in the last year with the hiring freezes due to COVID-19. We're so glad that you are able to join us. Now, as you can see, because of our large numbers, we have chosen to mute you during the presentation, but we invite you to use chat and also the nonverbal expressions, the thumbs up, the heart, I don't know what that's called, the little glee sign. All of that is welcome. We just ask that you do keep it professional and on point. Also, just a reminder, this event will be recorded and will be posted publicly, likely on the National Communication Association website, hopefully sometime this summer. We will only record and post the speaker view. So if you do not want to be on the recording, feel free to keep your camera off. The schedule for the day is as follows. So we are going to begin with our first speaker, Dr. Nancy Baym, and then we're going to have a little short question and answer. And then around half past the hour, a little bit further than that, we'll have a short break. And then we will have an introduction of our second speaker, Dr. Ray Holloway. Again, about 15 minutes of Q&A and wrap up. We should be done completely in about 2 hours time. So with that, I am going to turn us over to one of our fantastic Arizona State doctoral students, Kiki Van Essen, and she is going to introduce our first speaker. Take it away, Kiki.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tracy, and I'm very excited to introduce Dr. Nancy Baym. I practiced it. I'm so sorry. Dr. Nancy Baym.
You did really good.
Good. And she earned her PhD in speech communication at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign in 1994. She was an assistant professor of communication at Wayne State University for 5 years before moving to University of Kansas, where she was a professor in communication studies. In 2012, Dr. Baym moved to Microsoft Research, where she's now a part of an interdisciplinary research lab charged with conducting curiosity-driven research with the potential to help shape the future of computing. Her group hires PhD interns who are often curious about and sometimes go into industry careers. She also works with PhDs in communication and related disciplines who work in other divisions of Microsoft and other companies. Please help me in giving a warm virtual welcome to Dr. Baym.
Thank you. I have to say that this closed captioning called me Tractor Beam, and that's going to be my new name in the future. You can just call me Tractor Beam, okay? Oh, this is scary. I have to see myself? Is there a way for me to change this so that I see you folks and not
Yes.
be? Yes. Okay, great.
So if you
And
go
there's
up,
I can hide myself, right?
yeah. Okay, I'll give you these.
I got it. I'm good.
Great.
I'm good. Okay. Thank you. Well, hi, everybody. Thanks so much for coming. I recognize a few of you. Thanks for coming extra. Those who already know what you're getting into with half an hour of me. Extra nice. Great to see all of you. And thank you, Sarah and Marco, for organizing this. It's like Sarah said, this is something that I feel I was not at all prepared for, quite the contrary. And more, it does seem to be more and more important. And I certainly over the years have encountered more and more PhD students who are curious about industry careers at a minimum. So I'm happy to be able to offer my perspective. That said, I think I'm a very atypical example. So I think that probably much of what you have to learn from me is more from what I've seen than what I've experienced in some ways, not all. So I said I was going to share my story, and I guess I will start a long time ago to point out that I was born to two university professors who then divorced and married other university professors. So I went into the family business, right? When I was an undergrad, I thought, I'm not going to go to graduate school. I'm going to get a job. And then I was a senior in college and I said, I have no idea how to get a job. I don't even know what a job actually is. And please don't ever make me wear pantyhose. And I don't get summers to do my own thing and go to Europe. And I think I'll go to grad school. So I went to graduate school and I was getting a master's. I was saying the same thing. When I finish my master's, I'll go get a job. And then my master's started to end and I realized once again that I didn't actually know how to get a job. And so I got a PhD and I didn't know how to get a professorship. And in fact, I would say the message was pretty much conveyed to me throughout graduate school that if I finished and I did not get a tenure track professorship, I was a failure. And if I did something that, God forbid, appealed to the public, then I was really a failure. Right? So I was really trained, as I think PhD students still are, to become a university professor, to do work that contributed foundational knowledge, that built theory, and that the application of that knowledge should be left to others. So that's where I spent an awful lot of my life. As a graduate student, this I think becomes relevant. As a graduate student, I was training in interpersonal communication. My undergraduate had been in mass comm. My graduate was in interpersonal. And in the early 1990s, I found out that there was this thing called the internet and that people were talking to each other by typing stuff in forums and building social worlds. I couldn't believe it. It was so cool. So I said, I got to write a paper about this. So I went to the library and I had the very good fortune of being at a moment in history where when you went to the library to learn about how people built social relationships online, what you discovered from the existing literature was that that was impossible. You couldn't convey nonverbal cues. We would become mean. It would never work as a medium for sociality. So, you know, there might be some particular very specific tasks for which it would be good, but for actual social stuff, forget it. So I kind of had a research topic then. So that's what I did. I wrote my dissertation about online community using pretty much ethnographic methods, which at the time I will say was a bit of a stretch to say, no, really, you can do ethnography on the internet. It was in fact a stretch to say, really, this is interpersonal communication. You know, when I went out on the job market, people would say, well, this is really cool stuff, but it's not interpersonal because people are using machines. So, and the interpersonal textbook said right on them, you know, face-to-face communication. So I was without a home in the field. But I did find a position at Wayne State where I was quite happy and given a lot of opportunity to teach and to develop as a scholar. Jack Kay was the chair at the time, the late great Jack Kay, and I remain eternally grateful to him for his support of me because he really let me do my own thing in the field of what we then called computer-mediated communication. I went on to the University of Kansas. I was a very happy professor. I was a very, very happy professor. I had no intention of leaving the academy. If you had approached me in 2009 and said, do you want to leave the academy? I would have said, no, 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 no. I will admit that I had become a little bit curious about these people I was seeing who were at conferences I was at, and they had jobs at Yahoo, or they had jobs at some place like that. And I sort of thought, that's kind of interesting. But then one thing I noticed was that the next year they were working for a different company, and the year after that they were working someplace else. And I thought, I think I'll stick with the academy. That's, I'll just stay put. That works. So I really had no intention of leaving the academy. So, and that's probably one way in which I'm different. Had there been a workshop like this, I would not have shown up because I would have thought, no, that's not for me. So that being said, I was invited to Microsoft Research to spend a few months working with Dana Boyd and the other folks who were around the lab, doing some foundational research of my own choice. Just come hang out with us. I was a little too naive to know that I was being recruited. I found that out after I took the job. But I took the opportunity, and I really fell in love with Microsoft Research. I fell really, really, really hard. I fell really, really hard in particular for the New England lab where I work. And I can talk about why in a minute, but one thing that I want to say, another piece of atypicality, but I like to mention it because I do study Twitter and social media and those kinds of issues. And one thing that one often hears is, you got to be really careful with your self-presentation on social media. You got to be really professional all the time. And the reason I was invited to Microsoft, I knew Dana Boyd, but the reason she invited me to come was, as you may know, Dana spells her name in all lowercase letters. And at the time, pink with the exclamation point at the end was super popular, all caps. So I started joking on Twitter one day that I was going to change my name to Baym, all caps with 2 exclamation points at the end. And then people started joking on Twitter that I should write an article with Dana Boyd, and we would drive all the copy editors crazy between the all caps Baym, 2 exclamation points, and the all lowercase Boyd. And that just sort of went around Twitter as this silly little joke all day. And at the end of the day, Dana wrote and said, I'd be honored. Would you like to come spend a couple of months with me and we could do something together? So take that as a lesson that sometimes it's being silly that actually warms people to you. And that super cool professional exterior is not always the best path. I'm a big advocate of fun. So what I loved about Microsoft Research, what really excited me about it, was that we have a lot of different disciplines working together. So the chance to really, I feel like in universities you hear a lot about interdisciplinarity, but there's a lot of things that prevent interdisciplinarity from being rewarded. So I personally felt constricted by the field of communication when people told me, if you really want to be an excellent communication scholar, you need to be publishing in this journal and that journal and this journal and that journal. And I thought, but that's not where the people who are going to cite my work are reading. That's not the right place for me to be publishing. It's not that I didn't want to publish, it's that I felt like this field was not the right venue to reach all of the people who might be interested in what I was interested in. And that remained a struggle. So like when I went to academic conferences and communication, I often felt sort of at the edge of the field. Lots of stuff in it I loved, but I often felt very much at the edge. And then I could go to other conferences and feel at the edge of them as well. So it was really exciting to be in an environment where there were mathematicians talking about how to do sphere packing in 24 dimensions, and there were cryptographers talking about how do you prove that a proof is accurate faster than it takes to do the proof. And there were economists talking about how do you do this, and there were computer scientists talking about how do you do that, and I didn't even know half the words they were saying, and I could literally feel new neurons firing across valleys where never had a neuron fired in my brain. It was an intimidating environment. It was an extremely exciting environment, and I felt like, wow, I can really grow as a scholar here. It's an unusual environment because it is a basic research lab, a foundational research lab, and Microsoft Research is an unusual organization in industry because it is committed to doing foundational research that advances our field, and it's committed to being in communication with the academy and moving ideas back and forth. There are not a whole lot of jobs in tech for researchers that have that quality of being truly curiosity driven, where my job as a researcher is exactly the same as it was when I was a university professor. I decide what problems I think are important. I decide what research questions are worth pursuing. I decide what methods I ought to use. I decide my time scale. I decide where it ought to be published. Nobody reads it before I publish it. There's no pre-publication review. And out it goes into the world. Maybe it's read later. Now that said, there is engagement with the rest of the company. Today I spent an hour in a meeting talking about things with the product group. Yesterday I spent a lot of time with product groups. I just spend time interacting with product. I'm not building product, right? I might be helping people who are building product think about things that they may not have thought of. So for example, I was in a meeting this week where we were talking about what kinds of information might you surface about somebody, or what kind of connection might you, if you wanted to connect somebody to somebody else, what might you consider? And I was able to point out some of the things that could go wrong in that scenario that weren't on their mind. So there are interactions like that. This year I've become really involved with a cross-company effort around understanding the future of remote work. There have been a couple of publications that have come out of that recently, not academic publications, but more, well, I guess a white paper report kind of a thing called the Work Trends Index. And then there was a Harvard Business Review piece that came out of that a couple of weeks ago. I'm sure Joanne Keaton will get a kick that I'm publishing in the Harvard Business Review now. Encroaching on your turf, perhaps, but it's awful fun. I got a lot of catching up to do. So I joined a group that was me, Mary Gray, at the time, Dana Boyd, and Kate Crawford. We were together, and we were the people who were going to take big data and explain what it meant, the whys, what to do with it. That sort of was the vision of what people like us might do. And there are ways in which that is what has panned out. But I think that the main thing that I want to stress is that I'm in a position that is about curiosity and being curiosity-driven research. I would say that most work is in a different sort of work in industry, in the tech industry anyway, which I would say tends to be more driven by a thing that you're trying to build, or critiquing the thing that you have built. Not always, sometimes it's market research, but usually you're part of a team and you have a manager, and the manager is setting the agenda for what the research is going to be, and your job is to do that research. And that doesn't mean you have no power to set an agenda or no curiosity. So I know people, for example, who work on Facebook's news feed, and they can persuade, like anybody else, that they can persuade their manager that this is an important problem, then they can perhaps get the resources to do it. Even within divisions of Microsoft, people who have PhDs are in very different positions. So I've been in situations where somebody wants to collaborate with me, but their manager doesn't buy into it, and so they can't do it, right? Or if they do it, it's moonlighting because their manager doesn't see it as part of their purview, even if they have the skills. And it seems very relevant to me. If it doesn't seem relevant to their manager, it's not a priority, and so be it. So that's something to keep in mind if you are a researcher who really likes being a researcher because you really enjoy coming up with questions and answering them. Then industry may not be the place for you, because odds are you're going to be answering other people's questions, at least until you build the status and the trust that they'll let you ask your own questions. What else do I want to say? I guess I would say that the other thing that I do now that I did not used to do is I manage people. And that's a whole new set of skills that I didn't have before, and that I would not say I was Well, I was going to say, I was going to say that I wasn't well prepared for it, but it turns out that actually about the best preparation you can get for being a good manager is getting a degree in communication, because boy, I go to these management training classes and it's like, whoo, this is like 101 communication stuff. So maybe I was trained to be a manager, but it's a very different kind of people managing is something really different from what it looks like in the academy, in industry as well. So I want to spend a little time thinking about what are the kinds of jobs that I see. We work with PhD students in summer internships, and then we have folks who, like Chris Prasad, who's on this call, who were research assistants with us, who go on to PhD programs. And we see, we being the folks in my group, we see a number of people going on to a number of kinds of careers in industry. And we've had a number of PhD students who've gone into industry. And of course, we know folks in industry who we didn't necessarily work with, but who also have those backgrounds. And as I think about what kinds of jobs do they have, I would say probably the most common one is some variant of user experience research. And that is sometimes interview-based, and it's sometimes survey-based, it's sometimes observational. It can be a lot of different research methodologies. It also is often quantitative, and it's often computational. So it's worth, if that's a path you're interested in, if you're interested in answering questions like how could this interface be better, or what do people want in a system, certainly learn a bit about user research as an area, something that it shows up in like HCI programs and iSchools. It tends not to show up in communication so much, but it's not all that different from communication research. It's just got a slightly different angle, right? There's also people doing market research, interviewing segments of the population to try and figure out what are their needs, doing surveys with segments of the population to figure out their needs. There's people doing data science, and I will say that the people I know who really decided early in their graduate careers, I am going to go into industry, in tech, they learned to do data science. They picked up computational methods and can do things like scrape several million things and figure out what's going on in them with computation. And they're not computer scientists by any stretch. You know, it's not that much harder than learning R. You just got to learn it, right? So certainly picking up data science skills is really useful. I was talking to somebody the other day who said that at his company there are more openings for data scientists than there are data scientists. So that's a pretty good ticket in. One of the more interesting angles, in some ways, I think for some folks anyway, I think is interesting. The person who's in charge of policy at Twitter is a communication PhD, Yoel Roth, and he went straight from writing a dissertation about issues around privacy and safety and things like that on Grindr, and thinking about hookup apps and the issues there. He went straight from there to going to Twitter and working on policy about how do we deal with presidents who've gone rogue and things like that. So there's a huge range of kinds of positions, from policy to user interface. And I think one way to learn about the range that's out there is to be going into sites like LinkedIn or other sorts of job sites and just doing some preliminary, putting in researcher and looking at what are the kinds of jobs that pop up and what are things that you think you might be able to do and what kinds of skills are they asking for that you think you could pick up, and recognize that just like when there's a communication job that advertises that they're seeking this, and this, they're going to hire somebody who does those three things, right? They're not going to, unless they've got somebody in mind, they're not going to find somebody who does all of that. You don't have to fit it to a T, but it's useful to learn the language of the job ads and the skills that folks are looking for. A few bits of advice, and I'll wrap up. One thing that happened when I got to Microsoft that I realized I had forgotten is what it means to be an expert in a field, right? Because the whole process of earning a PhD is a process of getting so good at your discipline that you forget there were other ways of seeing the world before. And so being a communication professor became pretty invisible to me. And if you ask, well, as a communication professor, what do you bring? I could kind of say something, but it wasn't until I was in a situation, like I say, where I was with mathematicians and computer scientists that I could say, well, I'm interested in the co-construction of meaning. And they'd go, whoa, what? And I'd say, yeah, people create social context through interaction. And they'd say, whoa, you got to tell me about that. That's wild, right? And another thing that I found was that I would go to talks by people in machine learning, and they would talk about how they had used a machine learning algorithm and it had taught itself to do a thing, and now it could explain 78% of the variation in that thing. And I would say, wow, that's pretty impressive, right? A computer taught itself to explain 78% of a thing. What's going on in that other 22%? I bet that's where the really good stuff is, right? I bet that's where the edge cases are that'll make us rethink things, right? So that was part of my awakening was, oh, my training was about finding the edges and finding the problems and finding where the meaning making isn't working, and helping people figure out what's going on there and how to think about those things. So one thing I would advise you to do is to remember that by the time you've got your PhDs, you have got a tremendous amount of skills that you have come to take for granted, and you don't surface them as expertise that you have anymore. Those things you're writing about in your comprehensive exams, they're not necessarily going to care that you can contrast this theorist with this theorist with this theorist, but they are going to care that you understand the world in that way, right? And again, that's kind of become invisible to you because you understand the world in that way, but that's a skill that you bring to others to help them. So for example, for whatever reasons, well, because of work from home, our CEO, Satya Nadella, started talking about a year ago about being very concerned about what was happening to social capital in organizations, and the idea that as we've moved to remote work, people might be, organizations are losing social capital, and what happens when you lose social capital. Great question, great problem, real problem, and there's some really nice data science work right now demonstrating that that's a bit of a problem. Turns out there's not a whole lot of folks in the company who can talk about social capital fluently because they're computer scientists, right? So I go into conversation with teams of computer scientists or teams of designers, and they want to think about this concept, and there's a lot they just don't know, and they're appropriately humble about that, as I'm appropriately humble about having no clue about the skills that they have. And we've been having some really, really great conversations where I can just help them understand. And in some ways, it's almost more like being in I used to teach a junior honors seminar where the very best juniors, we'd sit around a table and we'd have really great discussions about concepts. It's kind of like that, it's like working with really, really smart undergraduates who are very curious but really don't know a lot, right? So if you walk in there and you start saying, oh, the difference between this theory and that theory, they don't care. Right? They just want some real basics that can help them think about what do we do. And I think that's one of the biggest problems in the academic training that I had, is that I don't feel qualified to tell people what to do. And I think that I was pushed actively away from thinking of applied research. I was definitely taught that there was a hierarchy in which applied research was lesser than theory. And it's the exact opposite in industry. If you can't apply your ideas, unless you're in a lab where you can do things like think about spear packing in 24 dimensions, which turns out to have some practical implications. Yeah, you need to be able to translate to fairly basic levels in ways that allow people to think about what do I do about it, right? I was trained to make things more complicated and show how complicated and how many variables and how nuanced and how contextual and how situated and all of those things. It's like, that's great, but we're not building a new tool for every person in every situation, right? We're trying to make something here. And we have to ship in 2 weeks, by the way, which is the other thing. One of the biggest problems that I encountered was that, for example, I did a survey with Xbox last fall where they graciously allowed me to use the console messaging to deliver a survey. A month later, they're like, where's the results? It's been weeks, right? I'm like, give me 2 years, right? I'm a scholar. They don't want 2 years. In 2 years, it's irrelevant, right? They want it now. So that was a real learning curve to get fast on some things. What else do I want to tell you? So I guess what I want to tell you is get clear on your skills. And sometimes your skills are not just, I know how to do qualitative interviewing. I know how to work SPSS. I know how to program in R. I can do whatever. It may be that your skills are that you developed a lot of teamwork by working in a group situation. Your skills are that you're a great communicator. So you have those specific skills, the methodological skills, but there are a lot of skills that are tacit that you can also surface as part of your expertise. The last thing that I guess I'd like to say before opening up and taking as many questions as I can is that more and more tech companies offer internships for PhD students now. Google has internships, Facebook has internships, Microsoft Research has internships, and many people who want to go into tech make their way through those internships. There's at least one person on this call who I know has had a Microsoft Research internship. I won't out you, you can out yourself. But those, keep eyes open for those. Ours, we list at socialmediacollective.org. Usually we announce it around January. But there's many of them, and I know a number of people who have done those. Sometimes they're great, sometimes they're awful. I knew one person who did a summer internship at Twitter, and it was terrible, and she decided she was definitely not going into industry, and she went to the academy. So they vary in how good they are. But I don't think all Twitter, for those watching at home, I don't think all Twitter internships are awful. I think she just was, it was a mismatch. It was a mismatch between what she thought she was going to do and what they actually wanted her to do. I know other people who've had incredible internships with Twitter. So there's a lot of variety, but do keep an eye out for that because it is a very normal thing, and they are paid internships as well. So it's a sweet gig as well as a gig that can advance you. So with that, it looks like we're at about half an hour, and I'm happy to take any questions any of you have.
Fantastic.
Ask me anything.
Thank you, Dr. Baym. We appreciate that wisdom, and I have been watching the chat, and there's lots of questions and responses, and I'm trying to do my best to begin
to catch up on this.
No. Don't worry about catching up. I'll go ahead and I'll ask you, and so you can just don't have to pay attention to chat right now if you don't want to. So I guess what I would start with is, what do you miss about academia, and what do you not miss?
I don't miss grading. I have not had a moment in my life where I thought, boy, I wish I could slog through a bunch of papers right now. Haven't used that red pen in a while. Grading is definitely the number one thing that I do not miss. I loved teaching, and I miss teaching. I miss interacting with students. I'm really grateful for our our PhD program, intern program, because it does allow me to continue interacting with students. I also do continue to serve on PhD committees and master's committees sometimes. So I do continue to work with grad students, but I'd say there's also a kind of learning that you get when you know you're going to have to teach something. You know, when you read something knowing you're going to have to explain it to others, it sinks in a way that I don't get the chance to read that way anymore, because generally I'm reading because I'm writing a paper, and it's really about what can I pull together to do this paper, and less about how can I immerse myself in knowledge of this area, like when you're teaching a course. So I miss teaching. That's about it. You know, it's funny because like I say, it was the family business, and it was so much the family business that when I took the job at Microsoft, my mom says, well, I guess one of us had to get a real job eventually.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
Thank
Grading
you.
and teaching.
Here's another great question from our audience. This person asks, you said that Microsoft gives you a fair amount of space to decide what you're researching. Do you find or feel they value the input you offer? And do you think this is common? And then in other words, is industry more interested in employing experts like, see, look, we've done our due diligence, or actually listening to what the experts have to say?
All right, that's a great question. And I want to point out that Microsoft employs 160,000 people worldwide. So there is no thing that is Microsoft that listens or doesn't listen. There's teams here and there's teams there. And a person on this team might end up on that team. Then the team that listened to you yesterday might not listen to you tomorrow because the person who thought that you were super insightful has now moved to another team. By the same token, a team that thinks wasn't very interested yesterday, something might have happened and suddenly they think you're fascinating and they really want to hear what you have to say. So it's really not a question of, I think this is actually one of the biggest illusions, and I see this a lot also in research that critiques, say, Facebook, or that critiques big tech, is that they think there is a thing that is Facebook that they can critique, rather than it's an organization made up of a lot of different dynamics, many of which are in opposition to one another, you know? So I would say, and I also would say that, okay, so I would say there have been times when I felt frustrated that I'm not listened to. Mm-hmm. There have been times when I've felt surprised that I was listened to as much as I was, or heard by the people who heard me. It varies. There have been times when my expertise is much more relevant than other times, right? The fact that suddenly everybody was working remotely and I know about computer-mediated communication and how people interact on things like Zoom, suddenly that's an asset that wasn't so much of an asset before, right? That I know about online relationships, because suddenly that's really important. It wasn't something they had to think about as much when Microsoft could assume that its customers were also interacting face-to-face in their offices, right? Suddenly, if Microsoft is providing the tools that are the tools through which people do all of their interacting for business, that changes things a bit. So suddenly somebody who understands relational dynamics has a message that's more useful. So I think the problem of being heard or not being heard has a lot to do with, can you take the things you know and convey them in a way that people can use? And I will also say that one reason I think I'm not heard when I'm not heard is that I don't know how to communicate it in the way that it needs to be communicated. It's not at the right level and it's not practical enough. So I look back sometimes on like PowerPoints that I gave to product teams when I was invited fairly early, and I'm like, well, of course they never called me back, because I may have helped them think about it, but I didn't give them any hooks to take home and do something with, right? So I'm still developing that skill.
What about,
can I just say one other thing though? I wanted to say that when you show woohoo, we have the experts, there is actually another component to that, which is if you come take a job here, you're going to get to work with people like this, right? And that's an appeal. So like when Microsoft is hiring superstars in computer science to do foundational research, that's partly because they know that makes it a more attractive place for a person who's just finished an undergraduate degree or any other degree in computer science to come work, because they're like, ooh, wow, they're working there, right? So they must be okay, right? So I don't want to undervalue what it means to have experts there, because it allows Microsoft to engage the academy in ways that they couldn't if it weren't people that the academy respects, right? So it's partly about relationship building, not just about PR.
Got it. There's a number of communication scholars who find themselves being critical scholars who might be interested in discussing the harms of things. Is that even possible in a position like you have, like to research the ways that a certain Microsoft program, could be, hurting people in an inequitable way? Or because I have some user experience graduate students who like the idea of doing user experience research. And Melinda, you might want to reflect on this later as well. But, also user experience research sometimes might want to try to get people addicted to a certain platform, for instance.
Right. How do you make it stickier?
Yeah. So is it always research that is focused on increasing the profits of the group that you're working with, or are there ways to include those critical sensibilities?
I would say there are ways to include those critical sensibilities, and I am certainly bringing a lot of critical sensibility to the encounters that I have within the company. I'll give you one example, which is I won't take credit for pointing this out, but I will take credit for being part of the conversation when it occurred to people that, having all these really fantastic analytics in our software that allow us to do really great things, like tell you how you spent all your time, could be read as creepy surveillance. Mm-hmm. Right? And guess what? I can tell you about surveillance because there's research about surveillance, and I'm qualified to go read it and help you understand what are the danger signs here. I would say companies have different tolerances for that. And I would also decouple trying to think about harms and be critical from being nonprofit driven, because I think that a good company, a moral company, will say that if our products are harmful, then in the long run that is bad for business, right? So like I know folks working on the Facebook newsfeed team. Again, these things are very localized within a company. So it might be that you're on a newsfeed team, and maybe some folks are working on how can we make the notifications more compelling so that people check more often. But then there's other folks on those same teams who are going, whoa, all of this anti-vaccination propaganda is a real problem. How can we work together to help figure out how to make the health information on our feeds more accurate, right? So I would say, like, for example, there are a number of companies right now that are explicitly very concerned with equity, and they really want people to help them understand the dynamics around race or around gender or around class or around ruralism or those kinds of things that may create inequities. So there's definitely a place for critique. I think the trick is to not be a nattering nabob of negativism all the time, but to follow critique with, and here's something that would make it better. Yeah, right? Yeah. And if you made it opt-in, then you could avoid that problem, for example, right? So it's easy for those of us who are critical, and I find myself doing this, to say a team wants to demo something for me. I want to go, well, that's wrong, and I don't like that, and that's stupid, and why would you think that's a good idea? And then I wash my brain of that immediate instinct, and I say, wow, there's actually a lot of really cool, interesting things in here, and there's some rough spots that I can help them understand, and I can help them understand what's great about it, and I can help them understand where the rough spots are, and we can kind of reach a middle ground. I think one of the habits that is good to unlearn is arrogance. I think many of us, by the time we've got a PhD, we're like, I am the expert, and here I am to tell you. And they're experts too, right? They are experts too, and you know less than they do about what they know. And you really have to have a lot of humility, I think, in order to have impact.
Mm-hmm. You know, I was asking Dr. Ray Holloway just before we opened this up to the general public, just when we were checking our mics and everything, whether she advertises anywhere or tells people that she has a PhD. And that's a topic that has come up in a book we're using in a class. And I'm wondering how much do you let people know that you have a PhD? Is having a PhD important for the job that you have right now? Or is it just the skills that you got from getting a PhD?
My job requires a PhD.
Got it.
To
Okay.
be a researcher at Microsoft, you have to have a PhD.
Okay.
So it's crucial.
Got it.
And I think that I would not say that everybody in the company knows that we have PhDs. And I don't make a big old point of it, but you know, I don't walk into the room and be like, "Hi, I'm Dr. Baym." But you can call So I don't know if people know, but I'll say also that, you know, I'll be in a lot of, like, it's not uncommon for me to meet people in product groups who also have PhDs. You know, I was talking with somebody who's a community manager for a very popular Xbox game a few years ago. He's got a PhD in neuropsychology, and man, that man knows his methods inside out. He knows how to weight a survey to keep the heavy users down. You know, he's got a tremendous amount of expertise, right? So you'd be surprised who's got PhDs and who doesn't. I wouldn't say I run around boasting about having one, but it is a requirement for
your position.
Be a researcher at MSR.
Got it.
We're about just under we're probably about 800 or 900 researchers worldwide.
All right.
Almost all computer scientists. We have research labs primarily in Redmond, Washington, and then we have 3 in the Northeast, in Montreal, New York, and the one I'm with in Boston, one in Cambridge, England, and one in Bangalore, India, and then in Asia, in China as well.
So we've had a number of questions, and we just have a few minutes left until we go to break, but we've had a number of questions asking about a resume versus a CV, how to best brand oneself, how to get into a job position. And for those of you who have asked those questions, I did link a book that we're using right now at Arizona State University that provides a number of tips and suggestions on that. But folks really want to hear from you, Nancy. A couple tips in regard to that you think are most important?
Oh boy. You know, I mean, in a way, I'm really not the right person to ask, because the CVs that I review are for our postdocs and for our interns, and those are very academic. You know, that's the same CV you're going to be sending out if you're looking for a professorship. So
okay.
I'm not really well qualified to answer that, and I don't want to give you bad advice.
Well, you're a wealth of information on so many other things. I want to close with this question that brings us bookend in ways to one of your first stories about your being a little silly on Twitter, and that's getting some traction. You have an active and interesting and multifaceted Twitter feed that I have enjoyed reading and learning from and laughing from and so on. Any advice for people who want to increase their followership? You have a lot of followers on Twitter. Any suggestions there?
I think the most important thing with social media, if you would like to be more visible, is to find the communities find the people you're interested in being connected to. And again, it's humility, it's conversation. The worst thing you can do in social media is show up and say, you know, here I am. Let me tell you about the paper I'm giving. I'm going to give a lecture. You know, it's like a party, right? If somebody comes up into a party and they go, hi, I study this. Let me tell you all the things I've done lately and how important I am. And another thing I know, and here's another thing I know, and let me tell you some more things I know. You find another conversational partner fast, right? And if they show up and they show interest in you, then you're much more interested in them, right? So it is a conversation, and it is a listening process. My own Twitter growth has been very, I mean, I've been on Twitter for a really long time, and that helps. You know, it didn't used to be so big, but you stick around long enough and you tweet every day and you wind up in conversations and you get retweeted. And then something weird happens, like our lovely mathematician, Henry Cohen, told me an incredibly magnificent story about a woman who could see 4 dimensions very, very, very clearly. She could visualize them. And I tweeted about that. and it caught people's fancy and it went viral and I got, a few hundred in a day. That's stupid, right? People who 200 people going, oh, she drops awesome math facts. Well, in 50,000 tweets, that was your one math fact. Glad you liked it, right?
Right.
So I don't put much stock in how many followers you have. I think it's really a question of, are you reaching the people? Are you in conversation with the people you'd most like to be in conversation with? And I would say, for me, Twitter is not about self-promotion at all. For me, Twitter is largely a way of connecting to people, thinking about things I don't think about. I've learned an enormous amount about Black feminism from Twitter. I've learned a lot about different grad students from Twitter, different areas of fields I'm interested in that I don't know about from Twitter. So I approach Twitter as a reader, as a way to learn and to have pleasant conversations, and as a place where I can drop whatever goofy thought has popped into my head. On occasion, I do share that I've done a thing, but I think that I'm personally turned off by self-promotional Twitter. That said, I will say that another thing that I have seen is somebody like Zainab Tufekci, who I think that's how she says her name, and I'm sorry, Zainab, if I got it wrong. Zainab is awesome. She got a PhD in sociology. She decided she wanted to be a public intellectual, and she just got on Twitter and she got super serious. Now, obviously, she's extremely talented. If you've read her work, you know that she's got a real knack for understanding things and conveying them in ways that people latch on to. But you could just watch her. She said, I'm going to be an expert. And she had something smart to say about everything. And she had a real consistent tone. And she worked that tone and she built a brand for herself as a really smart cultural commentator. And she has turned that into a New York Times column and things like that. So it really depends what you want out of Twitter, or social media.
Right.
Yeah. Have a good web page though, with where your stuff is.
Yes, for sure.
Yeah, that's probably more important. I remain, and I've written about this, I remain unconvinced that you need to use social media to have a good career. Our postdoc has no social media presence, and we hired him anyway. It's amazing. So, yeah.
Thank you so much, Nancy. What we're going to close with is anything that you especially took away from Nancy's discussion with us or her Q&A with us. I invite you to drop that into the chat box, or any other love or acknowledgments or lingering questions or whatever. Yeah, feel free to put those in the chat box. And please join me in giving Nancy a big virtual round of applause. We really appreciated your expertise, your wisdom, your time. I hope you are going to have an opportunity at some point, and we can share the chat with you later as well, to see how much people have appreciated your insights. People have been sharing your articles and all kinds of things there. So really generative. What we're going to do now.
Thank you.
Yes. What we're going to do now, everyone, is take a 5-minute break, and then we will return here at 45 minutes after the hour, a quarter till the next hour, where we'll move into the second half of our workshop. So see you soon.